Welcome to the class. You know, when I first learned that I would teach international business law, I was very excited. I love international things. I love to travel. I've seen the world, speak a couple of languages. I love everything that is international. And then I love the law. I like thinking about the law. I like researching the law and thinking about how the law affects our daily lives and how this legal framework affects business and society as a whole. But I had a problem. When I first sat down to plan out the course, and I started with an outline, because I'm a big outliner, and I started with, at the top of the outline, international business law. And I hesitated for a second, because I thought, well, what does that really mean? What is it that we're going to cover? International law, what is it that really means? What does international law refer to? So I did what every lawyer does when they don't know an answer, is to go look it up. And so I immediately went and started doing some research about the question of what is international law. And what I first found was really not too encouraging. We'll talk about what I found out, but before we get to that point, what I want you to think about is, what do you think it is? Because certainly you signed up for this course with one idea in mind, and that idea may or may not be reflected in what we teach in the course. So think about what it is, and then I'll tell you what the experts say in terms of what is international law. So in this lecture, we're going to introduce the concept, the framework of international law. So what is international law? I told you that I went and looked it up, and the very first answer I got was a bit disturbing, unsettling. And that's because the first thing I found out, the first possible definition of international law, was it is imaginary. Well, you can imagine that was a bit unsettling to me. What am I going to teach in the class if international law is imaginary? And it's not really that there are not rules that govern international situations, but this argument that it's imaginary really refers to the fact that it's not law in the way we think about the law. For instance, we think about the law in terms of it being written down somewhere. Well, some international law is written down, some of it is not. We think of the law as being the command of the sovereign government that issues the laws that tell you what you can and cannot do. Well, in the case of international law, there's no international sovereign. We have situations where we have international organizations like the United Nations, but they're not a sovereign in the sense that we think of as sovereignty. And finally, there's a whole question of enforcement. If, in fact, there's no enforcement mechanism, then how can it be law? You know, when you are driving down the road and you exceed the speed limit, you break the law, there's a mechanism in place. You stop, you get a ticket, you pay a fine. Maybe if you're driving fast enough, you go to jail. But there's a process for enforcement of the law, and it's the enforcement that gives the law meaning. So this first question of what is international law, this idea of imaginary has some basis in fact. Now, we'll cover all those possible perspectives, and then we'll explain why that may or may not be true. But certainly it is an issue, and as we go through this first section of the course especially, keep that in mind of the question of, is international law really law? Because we'll come back to that. But as I said, I just started my research, and I thought, well, this is not satisfactory, because I thought, if it's imaginary, does that mean that now I have to teach the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus, other imaginary creatures? But no, that's not what I wanted. So I look at, and again, what is the definition of international law? Well, it is international public law. And when we talk about international public law, we are referring to the law that governs interactions between states. the laws that govern how one country deals with another country. And so we'll spend a lot of time in our first lecture talking about states and statehood and the law that applies to those entities. We know that international law also is the law of international organizations, like the United Nations, like the European Union, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. It's the law that governs how those organizations interact with one another, but also how they interact with society as a whole, and how they interact with states. International law is also international trade law, and this has been in the news a lot lately, international trade. And for the last 2 decades, international trade law has not really been controversial, but we've seen a lot of reference to it recently, and therefore, when we talk about international trade, the system that governs how countries trade with one another, well, that's international law as well. What we'll focus on for much of the second half of the course, though, is international business transactions. This involves the international sale of goods, the international purchase and sale of goods. And this is where you guys in the future will likely be encountering international law in a much more personal situation. The law that governs how it is that a company in Stillwater, Oklahoma does business with a company in Istanbul, Turkey, that is international business transactions law. And finally, international law is comparative law. What we will see is that there are certain broad legal systems, categories of the law, and we'll explore each of those systems and compare them against one another. And the study of those systems is called comparative law, and that's international law as well. So our definition of what is international law, well, it's all of the above. Now we're going to be focusing more on a precise definition for you, but right now understand that all of those concepts refer to international law. Now what will we cover in the class specifically? Well, we'll start with international public law. I've broken the class down into 4 modules, and we start with international public law, the law that governs interactions between the states and international organizations, and sometimes the law that governs interactions between individual citizens and their own state. And we'll explain how that works in the future. The second thing we'll cover is the world's legal systems. We'll do comparative law. We're going to look at the 3 broad families of legal systems, which is to say the civil law, the common law, and Islamic or Sharia law. And then we'll start really what I consider the heart of the course, which is international business transactions. We'll spend a lot of time talking about a United Nations treaty called the Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, the CISG, and this CISG is what governs all of the transactions. The beauty of studying the CISG is that it's not applicable just to the United States, but it's the same law for the 80 countries that have signed that treaty. So when I give you a problem referring to interactions between the United States and China, that is equally as valid. I could have as an example a French company and a South Korean company, governed by the same law, the same international law. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about trade and commercial finance. We're not going to spend a lot of time in this area because it's a very specialized area of the law, but I do want to give you some broad background as to how it works so that you understand what it is that is going on in the world today. How do these transactions actually work in real life? So in conclusion, for this first segment, know that there are a number of possible definitions of international law, the 7 that I referred to earlier, And we know that we're going to cover 4 specific aspects of international law. I'm looking forward to it. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Come see me in my office if you happen to be on campus. Pick up the telephone and call me. I would love to hear from you. Thanks.